Tom Kraft.
We have in the audience, by the way, we have another person who worked with Jack Kirby. When Jack worked for the Ruby Spears cartoon studio on Thundarmany, and a gentleman named Buzz Dixon is sitting back there, was working with him, and Buzz worked on the Destroyer Death comic book as well, and Buzz has got a spotlight in this room in 2 hours?
I believe so.
All right, anyway, and Buzz will tell you he will correct all the stuff we get wrong. The premise here is monster influence. Jack Kirby was a monster influence, and he was influenced by monsters. And one of the fascinating things, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in the next hour, is that if you look at the early Marvel superheroes, an awful lot of scenes in there are very similar to scenes that were in horror and mostly science fiction movies that came out in the early 60s, and Jack used to take his son Neil to every matinee that had, the amazing colossal anything in it. And so as a result, if you look at the first issue of the Hulk, and then you watch The Amazing Colossal Man, you see certain similarities, and there's various similarities. For years, there was a guy who would come to these conventions who would lecture about the influences of monster movies on Jack, and his big finale, his big coup d'etat, the notice one he made a big thing like he had now liberated the entirety of comic book research, was to compare the character Ray Milland played in The Man with X-Ray Eyes to Cyclops in the X-Men. And he did this for years and years until some of us pointed out that X-Men #1 came out 2 years before The Man with X-Ray Eyes. And he destroyed that theory completely. Whereupon he had developed the theory that the movie was inspired by the comic book. So, Tom, this panel is your idea.
Yep.
Would you tell us the thesis on which you operate here?
The thesis is monster influence, so it has to do with the fact that, and it takes him from being a young person and being influenced by comics, or by the monster movies, mostly Universal films, which is a lot of Frankenstein and Phantom of the Opera and so forth. So it's comparing the two and how he was influenced as a young person, because he grew up on the Lower East Side in slums, and fighting and everything, his only escape from all that reality was to go to movies. And so when he was very young, he would go to these movies, and this is an image from Frankenstein when it came out in 1931. And these are the types of theaters that he would go to. And in interviews, he would talk about his mother coming, and he'd see these movies 7 times in a row, and he wouldn't leave, and his mother had to come into the theater and drag him out because he just wouldn't leave. And you can add, this is not just about going through slides too. Mike, you've had a lot of influence on in The Demon and all the other types of comics that Jack did and you have a lot of experience in movies and theater and so forth.
Well, I was a Saturday matinee kid and lived in a very small town, and the theaters were operated by an old-time exhibitor who, every chance he could get, whatever the occasion was, he would rent the inexpensive old Universal and Columbia and Paramount horror movies. And so I was raised at a different time on the same kind of movies that inspired Jack. But I think, if you think about Jack and everything he did, he channeled every one of his life experiences was channeled into his creative endeavors. And these films obviously had a great influence on him. There are the people who write about sitting with Jack and talking about his war experiences. We never talked about war experiences. Maybe it's because I had a young family, he had a family, and we had those things to talk about. But when we did talk about movies, it was Warner Brothers films from the 30s. And even they did a couple of pseudo-horror movies, starring Humphrey Bogart, etc.
Yeah.
But I think that the films definitely had a tremendous influence on him, and it may not have shown as much in a lot of his early work as it did in his Demon, but I think in doing the Demon, it just opened up that reservoir of memories and experience of seeing something 7 times in a row, and then he put on paper his version of it, and it became something in its own way totally unique, but based in his experiences sitting in that darkened theater watching those images on the screen.
Right.
Or I may be crazy as a loon.
No, you're right, actually. Well, you're crazy as a loon, but you're right about that. I was actually present at at the moment of the creation of the Demon. Jack had been working with DC, and the New Gods were selling decently, but they were not the Marvel-destroying hits that DC was hoping for. I think I am trying to finish up my big, giant, huge biography of Jack this year. And one of the points I'm trying to make to people about that era is that DC was a company that was in deep trouble when Jack joined it. And Jack was aware fairly early on in his run there that Mr. Infantino, who brought him into the company, might not be there very long unless the company had a dramatic turnabout. So the frustrations Jack had was he didn't think DC knew how to sell a book, and they didn't think he knew how to do the right kind of comics. And it was not a very good match because the company was operating out of desperation, doing, I think, some very foolish things. Well, at one point, the office, more or less, decided that the coming trend in comics was not superheroes, but monster books. Ghoulish things, Swamp Thing type comics. And Infantino asked Jack to come up with a ghoulish monster book of some sort. I think Carmine claims he said, well, some sort of character is a demon, and Jack said he came up with some sort of character. He wasn't one who applied the word demon to it. That's one of those arguments you could never resolve, and both people, went to their graves believing that they said demon first. But we went to dinner that night. Steve Sherman, myself, Jack, Roz, and the kids. And we drove to it. I remember this more vividly than anyone should. Mike will tell you I have a very good memory.
Oh, boy.
Anyway, we went to a Howard Johnson's restaurant where I had a hot turkey sandwich and for dessert, a scoop of orange sherbet with a cookie in it. And Jack would, as often, usually when we went to dinner with Jack, he would look at the menu, he'd decide what he wanted, and then Roz would tell him what he was going to eat, and he would go, okay, fine. And he'd eat whatever she said. This time he was absorbed in thought, and she ordered for him. And we were just sitting there talking, and Jack was completely quiet, like he was in another plane of existence. And he just sat there thinking and thinking and thinking. And then at the point where the waiter brought the entrees to us and put them out, we stopped talking, and Jack said, the character's named the Demon. His name is Jason Blood. He told us the whole first issue, the whole premise. It was all figured. If it was somebody else, you would have thought he must have spent a month working out all those details, because he had like the next issue and the next issue. He had villains, some of which I don't think he used. He had storylines already figured out. And we just kind of sat there chewing and listening to this thing. We got back to his studio, and he said to me, get out the look for the Prince Valiants. He had these Hastings House books of Prince Valiant reprints. And he said, look for the sequence where Prince Valiant puts a duck skin on his head as a disguise. And I found it. He was, meanwhile, at the drawing board drawing the rough of the Demon. He did the first drawing of the Demon. That evening, I showed him the Prince Valiant thing. And a joke, it was an inside joke that I don't quite understand. He wanted to use that as a reference point and have the Prince Valiant duck mask kind of be the model for the Demon. And he drew the whole first shot of the scene of the Demon that evening right in front of us, and the Demon was created right there. And it was obviously not completely out of thin air. It was obviously a distillation of a lot of different ideas he'd been kicking around for years and years and years. One of the things that I perceived about Jack's creativity was that a lot of it involved taking two things that nobody else in the world would have thought to put together and doing what we now call a mashup. He would take two items, he would take something he'd seen here and something he'd seen there, and it's like, and this is not a real example, it's like if he went, oh look, there's a guy on a surfboard. Oh, there's an Academy Award. And you got the Silver Surfer, or something like that. He would put things together in his head.
Sure.
And I'm assuming that in a labyrinth of antecedents we could never find, the Demon was two or three things from his past put together in enough odd way to create an original creation. And he did the first issue of the Demon. The premise was, at that point, that he was going to do the first issue, and then we were going to turn the book over to somebody else to write and draw. I think the writer would have been me, and the artist would have probably been one of the Filipino artists that DC was just then engaging. And he sent the book back, and the people in the office went, this is fabulous, this is so much better than the Fourth World stuff. Jack's got to do this book, and we've got to launch it monthly. which they would not have done. They didn't do that with New Gods for People. Remember, Jack begged them to make the monthlies from the start because he thought that the day of the bi-monthly was past in comics. The kids would not warm up to a comic that took them 2 months to get the next issue. And Demon was launched as a monthly, and Commandy was launched as a monthly, and then New Gods and Forever People went away to clear time on Jack's schedule, and they weren't going to entrust them to anybody else to do. So anyway, that's how the Demon came to be, and I thought it was a wonderful comic. I didn't actually like it at the time, but when I read them later, I said, what am I saying? This is fabulous. This is, a great book. And Mike did, of course, his usual fine job on it, as he did on everything he did for Jack. And, they're reprinting them now, and they'll reprint them forever. It is fascinating to me.
And I love the fact that they're reprinting these forever.
Yeah.
Especially things like The Demon and some of the other books, because when they send the reprint check, I don't have to split it with Vinnie Coletta's estate.
Oh. Do you know, just off to the side, do you know about my conversation with Bruce Berry? Did I ever tell you about that?
You called him to tell him that DC had all of these reprint checks and they wanted to send them to him.
Yeah, Bruce Berry had vanished. And I, through a fellow named Richard Kyle, I found Bruce's current address and phone number, and I phoned him. And I said, DC has been looking for... Bruce got out of comics and didn't want to look back. He didn't want to be interviewed. He didn't want to talk about them. It was, when I called him, it was like, Mark, thank you for the work you gave me and all the help you gave me, but that's beyond, that's not my life anymore. I have nothing to do with that. I don't want to talk about it. I want to put it behind me. And I said, well, DC Comics is looking for you, and they've got some reprint money for you. And he said, well, thank you very much, but I didn't get involved in that. And he basically kind of hung up on me. And I thought, he thinks this is like $40 or something like that, which at one point it would have been, And I called it back, and he was like a little bothered. I called it back. I said, did you understand? I said, listen, I want to say one thing, and then I'll leave you alone for the rest of your life, Bruce. It's a lot more money than you think it is. You owe it to your family to at least find out how much it is. And he went, okay. And he called me 2 days later, and they were sending him a check for like $12,000 or something like that. Wow. It was some amount way more than he thought. And he apologized to me for being abrupt, and I never spoke to him again. But
Well, we're segueing here, but Bruce was an interesting guy. On his own, doing his own thing, he was a very talented illustrator. He could do things that looked like they were done by old masters at the turn of the century. And when he started inking, when I told Jack that I wanted to stretch my muscles on other things, Jack simply said, ink it like Mike. And I think Mike Thibodeau and Bruce Berry misunderstood what Jack was saying. He was saying, basically, finish my pencils, finish my statement. And I think they were intimidated by what I'd done, and they tried to imitate what I'm doing, and I really think that both those artists were capable of much better work.
Well, one of the problems, Mike, was that they were forced into the mold of working as fast as you did and being as productive as you were, which, of course, as we all know, is not humanly possible. There was no way that anyone could have lettered and inked everything Jack was doing by themselves. You couldn't do that. I mean, I know you did it, but it's not possible. So, and that was the problem. If Bruce had had the same amount of time that Frank Giacoia got on a job, it would have been a lot better. And if somebody else had lettered it, because Frank didn't letter it, both Frank Giacoia and Joe Sinnott, who inked as many Kirby pages as anyone in the world, said to me, I can't believe that Royer not only inks all that stuff, he letters it too. That's not possible. I think you were hoaxing us. I think you had another guy in the closet someplace doing half the work because
no, the reason Bruce wound up with Jack was because he helped with some backgrounds one time, because I met him through Richard Kyle, and I put with an assist by D. Bruce Berry on the credits.
Yeah.
And we segued, and it's my fault. People have asked me what my favorite Kirby book was. And I say, when I really think about it, it's The Demon.
Okay. Yeah.
And maybe it's because I identified with the memories that Jack was channeling into his creativity in each of those pages he was penciling. I could tap into that because in another generation, I saw it in reruns and on television and could identify with it. And Jack's take on, his channeling of his memories, in my opinion, was so phenomenal. To do his takeoff on the Phantom of the Opera and Frankenstein and those things, and have it be so exciting, dramatic, and I'm just here to tell you that working with Jack was an incredible time of my life.
Mark, were you involved in any of the stories for the Demon?
On the Demon, not really. I was involved in the first 2 issues of Commandy, and then I got out of there.
Okay.
But Jack's plan was, this is a strange thing, because Jack kept trying to do comics. He would not write, draw all by himself. He wanted to be an editor. He wanted to work with different people. You may remember this, Mike. You helped me get Dan Spiegel's phone number, because Jack wanted to do the first issue of Commandy and then turn it over to Dan Spiegel and me. And I didn't even know Spiegel at the time, but I gave Spiegel's number to Jack. He called him. Dan, who lived in Santa Barbara, came down with his samples, and Jack loved his work and said, "This is the guy." And he called Carmine and said, "I want this guy named Dan Spiegel to take on the book. After, I'll do the first issue of Commandy to get it launched, and then my staff's going to write it." The staff meant Steve Sherman and/or me. And then this guy named Dan Spiegel will draw it. And Carmine said, "No, you don't need this guy Spiegel." First of all, DC had kind of a prejudice against people who hadn't worked for them before. Mike countered that early on. Russ Manning, they kind of sloughed off when he looked for work for them. They didn't treat Russ Manning commensurate with his ability or his credentials, because his credentials were not for DC.
Well, for them, the world ended at the Hudson River.
Yeah, that's right. So Russ Manning could have been drawing Superman or something like that for DC at some point, and they didn't want him because they had their guys. So Carmine said to Jack, "You don't need this Spiegel guy. I'm going to give you a Filipino." And we didn't know what that meant. Obviously, 2 months later, we knew that DC had made a deal with all these Filipino artists, like Alfredo Alcala and Mr. Redondo and Alex Nino and such, to work for them from the Philippines for 4 cents a page. But we didn't know that. And so then when the Demon first came up, there was talk that Jack would do the first issue, and Carmine would say, "I'll give you another Filipino." And we went, "What is this?" And we finally found out what this was all about. But by that time, DC did not want Jack editing books he didn't draw, because they wanted editing to be done in New York. They put up with Jack being his own editor to get his art in their books, but they weren't going to put up with it to get other people's art. So, but I did not like the first issue of Demon that much. It took a while for me to. My tastes have changed over the years. I loved the new guys at the time, but I love it a lot more now. I didn't really even like Commandy that much when it was first coming out. I worked on the first 2 issues and then stopped working for Jack. And I didn't kind of read them that much. I bought them and I would look at them occasionally, and it just didn't seem like a great comic to me. And then one day, Julius Schwartz talked me into doing a Superman Commandy team up for one of his comics. And I went, and I said yes without realizing, oh, I got to read Commandy now, and I got them a lot, read them in 2 days, and went, what was I was crazy, this is a great comic. So anyway, we're getting off the, here's the point, I'll get us back on the monster topic. One of Jack's favorite comic books of all time was Dick Briefer's Frankenstein. Dick Briefer was a friend of his. Dick Briefer was one of the men who helped when they team inked the first Captain Marvel comic that Jack penciled. The first, Shazam Captain Marvel comic, and Dick was a good guy they knew. And Jack just loved Dick Briefer. I don't know how many ever saw Dick Briefer's Frankenstein. It was kind of a comic take. It's very strange. Over the years, it got more and less serious. It got very silly for a while.
It did this pseudo Karloff image, but the nose was up on his forehead.
Yeah.
Loved those as a kid.
Yeah. So there is some of that Dick Briefer Frankenstein in the Hulk. If you read I can't give you an example, but if you ever read a run of Dick Briefer Frankenstein, and then you read the Hulk, you go, yeah, I kind of see a connection there, a little bit. It was an inspiration. And obviously the visual of the Hulk took something from Frankenstein.
And Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah, and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
I have a belief that we all know the story about Hulk was gray in the first issue, and they thought it looked muddy, and they made him green in the second issue. A theory which Saul Brodsky told me was that Martin Goodman was aware that one of the big advertisers in comics those days were the Aurora models, monster models, and Frankenstein was featured prominently on them. And at that point, if you looked at famous monsters of film, you'd see Frankenstein was on every cover for a while there. And I think they just thought Frankenstein was hot again, and the Hulk was close enough, and they said, make him green. So,
Continuing with the movies that he grew up with, Phantom of the Opera was the first one, came out in 1925. Jack was only 8 years old when he saw that. Assuming that he saw that, I assume he did because he seemed to have gone to every movie. Frankenstein was a big influence. At that point, he was 14 years old. Dracula came out at the same year. He was 14 years old. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, a little later. No, actually, he was 14 years old then. 1931 seemed to be a big year for monster movies. And that one was Paramount Pictures. That was the only one.
Yeah.
The Mummy came out in 1932, and Jack was 15. King Kong came out later. Jack was 15. Oh. The Wolfman came out. That's the one that came out later. He was 24. And then later, The Creature from the Black Lagoon came out in 1954, and he was 37 by then.
AKA Triton.
Well, I have a feeling that Tom has demonstrated or illustrated some of the more famous films, but I'm sure that Jack probably, as a youngster, saw the Island of Lost Souls. What is the law? If you've seen the film, it's a great pre-code film, and you can look at that film and say, Jack had to have seen this, because it's got all the animals that have been turned into humanoid form. That's a great film. Other Paramount films were films like Supernatural, Horror in the Zoo, all kinds of things that I'm sure just went in there and stayed. It's like him picking that duck mask from Prince Valiant. It was just something that was in there, and he had the ability to defrag that computer and pull those things out without hunting for a password. And I think that it's just, I remember such and such. There are things that a talent like Jack just absorbed, and they just waited to be released in some new form or another.
Do you think Jack had a photographic memory?
Yes, but it wasn't developed. No. Jack, like, there are certain artists who remember visuals in a way. When DC and Marvel did that Wizard of Oz adaptation, remember the Wizard of Oz big tabloid they did? Mm-hmm. John Buscema penciled that from memory, having seen the movie 30 years earlier. He did not have stills of all those people. Now, I think the inker Tony DeZuniga did, but the point was, they said to John, "You want us to get you a print of the movie?" And he went, "Nah, I remember it." And there are artists. Dan Spiegel was one of those. Dan Spiegel could remember when I bought my house that I'm in now. Dan came down for lunch. I was still in the old place, and we just drove by my house. He said, "Let me show you your house." Okay, so I drove by. So that's the house I bought. We drove by it at 20 miles an hour, and then went off. And Dan went home and sent me a drawing of my house. He drew it from memory. He could do that. He was that amazing. And people, they remember pictures, and Jack remembered concepts that way. And they pop in all sorts of places. They pop into his speech. There's a lot of phrases you'll go, look at Jack comics and go, what does that mean? What does that phrase mean? I guarantee you it means something. Everything means something there, but sometimes the segue is a little obscure, and he would get these thoughts in his head. And when we talk to Jack, when you just talk to him, sometimes he'd say something you had no idea what he was talking about. And
sometimes he would tell you something, make a point about something, and then he'd say, in other words, and tell you the same thing from a different access point. I always found that interesting. Jack was this incredible talent that you talk about Demon being created at dinner. He was always creating, and Roz always drove because probably Jack would have driven him off the highway because he was thinking he was somewhere else.
Yeah.
I once made a comment to my wife. I said, well, you know, Roz drives for Jack. Why don't you drive something? She says, you're no Jack Kirby.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons that Roz drove with the fear that if Jack was driving, he would feel compelled to run over certain people who reminded him of editors.
Oh.
No, he jumped around in topics a lot, and he would say something, and you would know what it meant, and then 3 days later you go, oh, I see, he was continuing another conversation from 4 days earlier, or something like that. There were these weird connectivities that would happen, and it was your fault in a way you couldn't keep up with him, and it was his fault for ignoring segues. He would just jump from one topic to another seamlessly, and and I think Jack had a little camera in his head. It didn't just work for visuals. Something interesting would be said around him. Someone would make an interesting point. He'd see something on a movie. He'd see something on a TV show. He'd read something in the newspaper. A little thing would be, click, I'm going to use that. Click, I'm going to use that. And he probably used, 10% of those things. But they were there, and he would put these ideas out and throw them out. Len Wein and Marv Wolfman, when they were kids, took him an idea for he wanted to see a comic they'd invented, they were going to try to sell. And he told them, if Marv were here, he would tell you the story. He suddenly told them all more about their comic than they had figured out it. He'd say, oh, and this guy's got a sidekick who does this, and there's a big giant monster here, and he just added on to it, started throwing things in, as if he'd been thinking about it for weeks. At one point, very late in his life, at Roz's urging, I came up with an idea for a comic I could do with Jack. She wanted me to come up with something that he and I would do together, and we'd do it. And I came up with an idea, the germ of an idea, and I went to Jack with it, and I said, would you like to, and I told him this idea, which I thought was a pretty good idea, and he started building on it, and building on it, and building on it, and building on it, and pretty soon, it was like if I'd gone to him with, I've got this idea, I've got a guy in outer space who's got like a lightsaber, and then Jack put everything that was Star Wars on top of it. And my idea was in there, it was buried underneath it. I could kind of claim I created it, but he had added all this stuff onto it because he had always had all these ideas and all these characters. You have probably seen the drawings. Jack did these pitch drawings of some of the New Gods characters. They were printed in many places. Some of them are in my book on Jack. There's a drawing of a guy, looks like Mr. Miracle. And he's got a gun. You know the drawing I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's a concept drawing that he did at the beginning.
Yeah, it's not a concept drawing of Mr. Miracle.
Oh.
It's another character.
Yeah, it's another character for the New Gods.
That guy was not going to be an escape artist. He was not going to be part of the fourth world. Jack had this idea for this costume. He had this idea for the way the character might move and certain things, and he kept rearranging this stuff. And the New Gods was always in flux. He would keep changing his mind. I told this story before, but when I was working with Jack, he would tell Steve Sherman and me, he told us the plot of the next issue of New Gods. And we would sit there and say, hey, that sounds great, Jack, because it did. And then we would do the most important contribution that we made to his work. We would leave. We would get out of there and let him work on his own. And we'd come back and he'd hand me the finished issue and say, here, give this a read through, make sure I spelled all the words right, like that. And I'd look at it and I'd go, this is great, this has nothing to do with the plot you told us last week. And he said, oh yeah, it's the same story I told you. And I said, no, it isn't. We don't, he'd say, this is a different story, it's a great story, it's not the same thing. And he'd go, really? Because he had just changed where he was going along.
Well, I'm segueing again from monsters, but he had a monster imagination, so that ties in. I'd been at Disney for a while, and he called me and wanted to know if I'd have time to work on a project with him, that I'd fit it in with Disney. It wouldn't have the same kind of deadlines as when I was working with him full time. And so we met for lunch at the old Copper Penny across from the bungalows of Warner Brothers. It's not there anymore, but we're having lunch, and he's telling me what I'm assuming is the first issue of Silver Star. And I'm thinking, God, this is going to be an involved issue. No, he had all 7 issues done in his head.
Yeah.
I had time for a couple of them. And
yeah. So this is the thing, if you take away nothing from us talking about Jack,
well,
understand that this man just had this incredible imagination, And it wasn't just the fact that he drew real neat pictures. He drew real neat pictures, but so did a lot of guys. He was not doing the same job that John Buscema did, or John Romita did, or Gene Cole. Not take anything away from them, but when John Buscema sat down to draw an issue of Fantastic Four, he was out to draw a good issue of Fantastic Four, and he did that. When Jack sat down to draw an issue of Fantastic Four, he was out to change the industry and put in 4 spin-offs and take comics to another level, and to come up with the plots and come up with the concepts. It's not the same input. And you know, I run into people now who say, well, I like the way John Buscema drew the Silver Surfer better than Jack's. Fine. That doesn't make him the equal contributor to the Silver Surfer that Jack was, because Jack conceptualized the whole character and gave him his energy and his reason to be. And
Well, and back to our theme, it's just growing up with these movies, and it's all cataloged and put away somewhere in here. And at some point, he's working on something, and it's, you know, it's like, wow, let's pull this out. This will work. Now, I don't know if that was the thought process, but that it seems to me that it was like that. In The Demon, he wants to do something on Frankenstein, and he's got all this input in here, and then he turns it sideways or inside out. But all those influences, I say this too often, but every life experience of Jack Kirby, he channeled it into his work.
yeah. And also, he was probably in all those things influenced by non-monster movies. Just because he was, you know, when he was drawing a Western, he wasn't just influenced by other Westerns.
Yeah.
He had plot ideas and character ideas from gangster movies or from non-genre movies. I mean, and that's again part of the man's brilliance to take things, put them together, was that he would suddenly be telling, you know, you think he's telling a story about Thor and Asgard. He's, to his head, he's telling a story about the relationship between, you know, some guy he knew and his brother-in-law or something like that. There's all these underpinnings. And as I read Jack's comics today, I keep seeing stuff in it that I hadn't seen before. It's like someone snuck in and added new elements to the story into my copies on the shelf. And I suddenly go, and I suddenly see things I recognize from Jack's life that I didn't see were there before. So, you know, I mean, yes, we can list lots of influence from monster movies in his work, but there's probably, you know, influences of, you know, monster movies in his romance comics, and influence from love stories he saw on TV in his monster comics and things like that. He did a story for Marvel. There's a half dozen jobs he did for Marvel late in the run, which kind of cemented his exit from the company. And one of them was a story called The Monster that ran in, it was Chamber of Darkness or Tower of Shadows, one of those 2 books. And he wrote and drew this story. You know the one I'm talking about, right?
I remember the typeface of the title.
Yeah, it was like an 8-page monster story, and he wrote and penciled this story, sent it in, and someone in New York, possibly Stan, certainly someone else, didn't like the plot and wanted it all changed to a very pedestrian, obvious thing. And Jack, with great anger and bitterness, erased the story he loved, that he was very proud of, and turned it into the story anybody would have written. The second time I visited Jack was the day after he had, maybe the third time I visited Jack. He was still living down in Irvine, California at the time. And Steve Sherman and I went out to see him, and he had just finished erasing this story and revamping the pencils. And you could see, if you look at the original art, you could see, you know, the erasure, other things underneath the pencils. And Roz was saying, I asked him to just put this aside and draw the story they wanted separately so we could keep this one. And he said, and he would like to punish himself for giving him such a good story. Jack had destroyed his own story. It's a thing artists frequently will do sometimes. They will destroy their own work because they have to purge some sort of emotion about it in some way. Alex Toth would do this after each panel. And he did that story, and that story was very important to Jack, the way he did it, and very unimportant to him, the way it wound up. And it was a story that had a lot in it, in his version, about his relationship with Roz, how she had seen through the bad parts of him to love him, and the way the woman in the story loved the monster in his version. I can't quite make sense of the final version of that story.
And in International Comic Con last year, since we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of Jack's birth, I was on 4 or 5 panels, and I went to sit in the audience in one that was the generation that followed me in the comic books, all these writers and artists who talked about what a great human being Jack was. They'd find his phone number in the telephone directory, they'd call him up, and Jack would invite him out to the house. He'd sign their comic books, Roz would make sandwiches. And I almost did something that I know I shouldn't have done, so I didn't do it. Now I regret not doing it. But here's 12 guys up at the table saying, basically, we all called Jack. And I wanted to stand up and say, but I'm the guy that Jack called. Because I'm walking across my backyard and the phone's ringing in the kitchen. And I go, hello, it says, Mike Ryer, this is Jack Kirby. Alex Toth says you're a pretty good inker. And it's like, my first response was, okay, who's pulling my leg here? You know. I was invited out to the house in Irvine. He wanted me to ink this page, a biography page for Marvel Mania. And I said, I'll have it tomorrow for you. And he says, no, just sit here at my board and do it. So my baptism of fire, as Mark explained to me, was to prove to Jack that it all came from my hand, that how I worked under pressure, and I guess I passed the test because until my comic book work appeared, I did a lot of stuff for Jack that to this day people think Jack inked it, and became like all of us who met Jack and worked with him and for him. We were extended family.
Yeah. He wouldn't let me borrow the car, but other than that, it was fun. Yeah.
So continuing.
Yes, please.
Based on all the other stuff that you've heard, these are a couple quotes about how he brought movies into his art. Probably had time to read them. So Frankenstein, of course, was a very big influence, and there was a couple issues. I think all of these were inked by you, Mike, right? Baron von Evilstein and the Rebirth of Evil were a 2-part series based on somewhat Frankenstein, but again, he took a lot of different concepts and turned it into this crazy guy that was making all different types of life and wanted to use Jason Blood to and the demon to extract his life force to do other kinds of life. So it's a very different concept, but the base is, of course, Frankenstein, and also the monster in the morgue. That one was for the Forever People that you inked as well. It was based on Sephirin. How do you pronounce it? Seraphim had those bullets, and he stole one of them and made his monster that he pieced together from the morgue alive again. So, Creature from the Black Lagoon. The obvious one is Fantastic Four issue number 97. And I think Giacoria inked that one.
Yeah, this issue is the one that was on Jack's drawing board the day I first met him. I went down, this is in July of 1969. A bunch of fans, of whom I was one, went down to visit Jack at his home in Irvine. That issue was half penciled.
Wow.
We were stunned by that issue. We looked at it and we could not believe how good his pencils were. I was impressed with the stuff printed, but to see it in person, in its pencil stage, without the bad printing and coloring on it, it was just jaw-dropping. And in a moment that froze me, I was terrified. Jack turned to me. My friends I was with had told Jack I drew it. I took along some of the fanzines I was working on, and I had done the covers here and there on them. And I drew well enough to be in a 300 circulation fanzine in 1968 or 69. I didn't draw well enough to be in much more than that. But Jack turned to me and he says, why don't you draw a panel in the story? And I just froze and I said, Jack, I'm not good enough to draw a panel in a story by the worst guy at Marvel, let alone you. Says my dad. He said, well, here, just draw a hand on this figure. There was a figure there that he had drawn the body and he hadn't drawn the hand on the figure. And he said, here, why don't you draw the hand on this? And I said, and before I knew it, he had me sitting in his chair at the drawing table. He handed me a pencil. He said, go ahead. And I froze, and I thought, and first of all, hands were the thing I drew worst. And then I thought to myself, number one, Jack's got an eraser. I'll draw lightly, he'll fix it up the right leave. But if he doesn't, and I assumed Joe Sinnott was going to ink this. Joe Sinnott will ink this, and it will be absolutely perfect. It'll fine. And it turned out Frank Giacomo inked it. I still think Jack erased it after we left and we did it. But I drew his pencil hand on there, and I realized in hindsight he was not auditioning to me to be an art assistant. He just kind of wanted to give me a chance to be part of a comic book. He saw in me that I was a kid who was, about to take the next step. I just actually started writing professionally like a week earlier. I sold my first magazine articles, and he just thought, I'll give this kid something that. And then the next day he recommended me for a job at Marvel Mania, where I worked for a while, and
that's how we met.
No, we met before that, Mike. I knew you a year before that. I'm sorry.
My memory is just terrible. Unlike this guy's who knows, he remembers the telephone exchange that we looked up to call Al Williamson in 1970 from Penn Station.
Yeah. Write this down. When Mike Royer was living in Whittier in 1969, his phone number was 213-944-5509.
Yep.
I don't know why I remember that, but that's what it was. Yeah. Now ask my social security number. I don't know, but Jack just anyway. That story was the first thing I saw of Jack Kirby's pencils in pencil, halfway done. So I just look at that.
Maybe we can find your hand.
Well, wait a minute, it's not on these pages. So.
Okay, let's continue.
Anyway, if you got any other pages from it, I'll show you the hand.
That's about it.
No, it's not on any of these pages.
Okay.
It's just a guy walking like this. He's got his hand out.
Okay.
Anyway, but he that was the kind of person Jack was. When he met someone, anybody in those days, it was kind of like, what can I give this person? There were people there, and he wasn't thinking like a sketch. There were people who went to Jack and they wanted a sketch. They wanted to come home with a Captain America drawing or a Thing drawing, something like that. That was like the worst thing you could get from Jack. The best thing was some inspiration, some concepts, some thoughts, a boost in your career. He'd shove you somewhere towards something he thought you should be doing. And I owe the man an awful lot, which is why I go to conventions all the time and tell you how wonderful he was. Great.
So in this issue, it was called The Monster from the Lost Lagoon. Very different. The monster is an alien at the end and leaves.
Yeah. Don't change the page yet. I'll show you something interesting here. That see, this story was lettered by Sam Rosen. The last thing at the bottom, the last page over there, it says "Next Mystery on the Moon." That's not Sam Rosen's lettering. This is how we know that when Stan Lee put the dialogue in on this story, he had no idea what the next issue was about, because he would have put the title in there if he had. So.
And on that last panel, the thing is saying if they ever make this into a movie, this will be a perfect spot for a fade out.
Well, Jack's the movies did have a great influence on Jack, and he once told me that during the day when Adams and Steranko were doing all kinds of weird impressionistic panel layouts and so on, he said, Mike, each of those panels is like the movie screen. It never changes its shape. It's what's going on inside the panel. And I took that to heart, that I think that was a very wise thing to say, that the movie screen never changes. But if you put some exciting stuff inside it, which he always did.
So, The Wolfman. And this is a classic Mike Royer inked Demon issue, The Howler. And it also has a sequence where the Wolfman or the Howler changes, which is very similar to the way it did it in the movie. So again, he's picking up on some of the themes, but it's a totally different type of story than that. Phantom of the Opera. This was a 3-issue demon sequence. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
It had to do with Jason Blood and his kind of girlfriend, Glenda, and Farley Fairfax was the Phantom in this issue. And you could see definitely the influence on the 1925.
That was my
photo.
favorite page, that close-up.
See how similar it is?
It was fun to ink. It was like, look at us like, God, this is great, Jack, you know. I was always seized with two emotions in the beginning working with Jack. I'd open the package of the artwork and be engulfed in the aroma of Roytan cigars, which was intoxicating. And then my conscious thought was, don't screw this up. And there were times that it was hard work, but it was fun because it was finishing Jack's statement. I don't think I ever really embellished. I just finished his statement. There were the people that say I just traced his pencils, which is not true. I finished his pencils. And I think Jack appreciated that. There are people who compare Joe Sinnott and Mike Royer, and I say that's apples and oranges. It's silly. Joe Sinnott, if you know old-time movies, the golden age of Hollywood studios, Joe Sinnott inked Jack Kirby, MGM. I inked Jack Kirby, Warner Brothers, or you could say Universal. It's what he put on the page was all it was necessary to sell the story. And MGM put tons of gloss and made things gorgeous. And so it's unfair to compare Joe Sinnott and I. We were thinking totally different things. Luckily, Jack was Warner Brothers.
Yeah. Well, you did some things like Joe. You couldn't help but it. There's a very strange thing with inking because over the years I interviewed all the guys like Colin and Buscema and Anita, and we always ask them, what do you think of your inkers? What do you want? And some guys would look at an inker and go, that guy did a great job. He inked it just the way I would have. And some people would say, oh, that guy did a great job. He put in all this stuff I never would have thought of. And there's a different train of thought there. Ross Andrew loved it when people added, the inker, basically just made it his own or added things or changed things. It was fine. He thought it, he felt he learned something looking at what the inkers did. He had some pretty good inkers. And Gil Kane would look at the comic and it didn't look like what Gil Kane had left Gil Kane, and he would think it was a bad ink job. Jack was absolutely satisfied with what Mike did. He was very pleased with it in a way he wasn't with many other people that we might regard as very talented, because he looked at the page and he saw what he was thinking. He saw Mike channeled what Jack had in mind frequently, and even if it wasn't absolutely clear in the pencils, which it usually was, Mike was able to understand, particularly separating the planes of the drawing. He knew what came in front of what other things. Jack, the only real time I ever heard Jack ever complain about one of his inkers was because he felt the guy inked everything with the wrong line weights. The line was a beautiful link line, but the background figures were coming forward and the foreground figures were going back because he had thin lines on the foreground figures and bold lines on the background. And Mike never made that mistake. He intuitively knew, or maybe it was conscious at times, that this was supposed to leap out at the reader and that was supposed to go back, and that was not part of that. And the colorists had very little trouble figuring out what body parts were part of which figures because they were all clearly delineated. And
I love that page.
it just looks you couldn't have done a better job with that. Somebody else might have tried to add a lot of their own textures to that face, but it obviously didn't need it. It was all there. Jack gave Mike everything, and Mike knew how to true it up and ignore construction lines and make the right things bold. And that's why the figure just leaps off the page.
Unequivocally, I will say right now, and thanks to this panel and Tom's visual aids, The Demon was my favorite book. And
Okay.
I think it's because I tapped into the things I grew up with on late night television that Jack saw firsthand. We were all lucky to know or experience Jack in different ways in different times, to rub elbows with his genius. And if we can read sign language, was that we have 5 minutes or?
I think we're done. I think
Well, as a friend,
wrap up things.
As a friend of mine used to say, we used to
Both
get
sides.
together once a month and watch old movies, and when the evening was done, he would just stand up and say, "Get out."
Okay, You want to run through everything else there? You got?
We have 5 minutes?
We have 5 more minutes?
We'll take 5 minutes.
We'll take 5 minutes, okay.
Okay.
4 minutes.
You want to go back to, so Dracula was, the big thing was the genocide, the big Count Dragon.
The Comics Code was rewritten to allow these issues.
Right, that was in 1969 or
71.
71.
No, literally, Jack said in the first issue of this, and Carmine said, we're gonna have trouble with the Comics Code on this, and he said, change it, and they did. The Comics Code was rewritten at that point, and Marvel came out with Mobius the Living Vampire. They started work on it afterwards, but Jack had done his first. Jack's was in first. And to his dying day, Jack was annoyed when people said, "Oh, you ripped that off from Morbius, the Living Vampire, as Spider-Man."
But it was a totally different concept, all about Transylvania, I guess it's pronounced, and this planet, this miniature planet that had a film projector that was showing off all these horror films. And so the little miniature people that lived on the planet started adapting the characters and all the horror movies. So we really used this one to really bring out a lot of those different types of themes.
Was that a bit autobiographical?
Probably, yes. Everything Jack did had some autobiographical element in it.
So the Wolfman, and then this whole thing with Frankenstein and the Wolfman and the Mummy and Dracula. And the Mummy, I found this goes back to what you were saying, like in the 60s with Neil. This is probably one of the ones that, you know, he referenced to. The Hulk with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He gets exposed, but it's not the same type of Hulk. It's not the same type of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He gets exposed to radiation. And then Commandy, Tiny with Commandy, it was very similar. In fact, when Tiny comes in and grabs Commandy, it looks exactly like when in the movie when what was the name of the woman in Hong Kong, the actress?
King Kong.
King Kong, I'm sorry.
Fay Wray.
Oh, yes.
Fay Wray.
Fay
Fay
Wray.
Wray, yes, Fay Wray. Fay Wray there. And then even on the last panel, it's kind of funny. He's the second to the last panel, he even brings up the idea that even if the ancients with their imaginative movies couldn't have produced anything like this. So it's kind of like a joke, because that was a really close thing to King Kong. That's all I got.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us here.
We started off by doing it. We were done with the movies, we'd eaten the snacks, and we just come in and say, get out.